So I'm Sergeant Tim Wallace, and I'm the Public Information Officer for the Lane County Sheriff's Office.
Well, yes. So, first of all, I know I was reading through, of course, the initial press release and then some of those others that you sent me. Thank you so much for that added context of these.
Yeah.
Um, First, I suppose, first question is if we can just talk a little bit about this most recent investigation, kind of what you guys uncovered and how that investigation started.
Yeah. You're referring to the investigation involving Agricola.
Yes.
Uh,
Yeah.
so that investigation is still active. So there's not a ton more I can say beyond the news release we put out, as our detectives are um, still working that case, and OLCC is still working that case. Um, I will say that the um, that case has been a little different from a lot of our other ones in that the company itself was more established. You probably noticed looking at a lot of the other search warrants we've done. There's usually been some kind of tie to either stolen guns or drugs or cartel. So in this particular case, the business was just operating so incredibly far outside of OLCC requirements, essentially not operating at all under OLCC requirements, um, that it extended to the criminal level by Oregon law, and so that's why our detectives assigned to this task force then stepped in and took over the at least the search warrant part of this case.
Yeah, and I guess anecdotally, so for that operation, you guys recovered about 10,700 plants, is what the press release said. Is that tending to be on the one of the larger side sort of bus that you guys normally see, or kind of what's the scale of that?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I would have to go back and look at our previous search warrants. I know we've had some um, I, outdoor grows that are probably of similar scale. This was definitely several locations. I don't know that we've had one with this many locations involved, and yeah, very very high on the number of illegal plants. And that was part of with the news release. Um, we Some of these grows were licensed, meaning that uh, at some point, at some time, they had done the paperwork to say these are grows, but they had essentially not done anything since to follow the OLCC requirements to continue operating as grows. Um, and then that's also where it gets into the code violations, which I totally understand. A lot of people, aren't the biggest fan of hearing, but what we've seen with other grows, these operations use a massive amount of electricity and water. Typically, the electricity they pay for, they have to pay for, they have a power bill, but oftentimes for the water, they're not um, when they're out of compliance, and I'm speaking generally because I can't talk about specifics to this company, but generally when they're what that means when they're operating outside of water compliance, that means they're drilling wells that aren't approved. They're pumping water straight out of rivers, straight out of streams, and so then that affects everybody else. Legitimate farmers, legitimate ranchers who are depending on that water. We've even seen some areas of our county where an illegal grow that wasn't dealt with for several years, it actually dropped the water table, and residents started to lose water. And their only solution would be to drill their well deeper, but they're competing with essentially a commercial enterprise with a large amount of cash, who can just drill their well deeper. Um, so typically these code violations, they're not. I think a lot of people think, oh, like residential code violations. These are usually things that affect other people, affect other residents, affect other businesses in their area.
And I assume too, perhaps in the summer, that those sort of water violations could also impact, firefighters having the water resources they may need for wildfires and things like that, potentially. I know that's probably a more extreme case, but
Yeah, well, and I don't do water. That's
yeah,
outside. That's I mean, and that's why on these we bring in the experts on this stuff. As law enforcement, we enforce law and specifically criminal law, not civil law. And so then when it extends into code, county code, city code, those sorts of things, we have the access. We're there by the search warrant, but those aren't things that we typically do anything with.
yeah, that makes sense. And I was also wanted to ask you, I saw bottom of all of those press releases, it does talk about the grant program that is going on that's helping fund these investigations. It's been going on for several years. And so can you just speak a little to that as to, the impact of that grant, how that helps law enforcement every year?
Yeah. So the easiest way to say it is if that grant didn't exist, these investigations wouldn't have happened. So, and I know that can be a frustration for our residents locally when they know how underfunded our sheriff's office is. We typically, our county's 4,700 square miles, over 100,000 people living unincorporated, and then about 360 plus thousand people in the whole county. So our county is about the size of Connecticut, to put that in perspective. And we have 3 deputies and a sergeant on a shift on average. And any call where there's potential for harm or a dispute, something like that, we're going to send 2 deputies, maybe 3. So if it escalates, then all 4 are going to go. And if that dispute is in Dune City, and then something else comes in, a domestic violence assault comes in up the McKenzie Highway, our deputies are 2 hours away. So I just want to put that in perspective, because a lot of times a community sees, oh, they're putting so much resource into this. But to your question about the grant, if this grant didn't exist, those positions, the detective sergeant and 2 detectives, one of whom has a drug detection dog, those positions just simply wouldn't exist. And by extension, these investigations wouldn't happen. So many of the investigations that you looked through, you've seen there's stolen guns recovered, stolen vehicles recovered, stolen firearms recovered, and illegal drugs. Those investigations continue. In those cases, it isn't, we got the marijuana we came for, and so we're done with the rest. Instead, a lot of times that illegal grow is what starts the investigation into, drug trafficking, human trafficking, which I honestly should have mentioned first, because and that might be a separate segue, because that's a whole conversation in itself. So really the like this Agricola investigation, without these positions, even with the violations, the criminal violations that were occurring, a couple years ago, before we had this team, if those violations were brought to us, we simply wouldn't have done anything. We wouldn't have had the staff. We can't use main office patrol to assist in an OLCC investigation. Typically, we don't have the staffing or the funding to do that. So participating in this program has allowed us to expand our investigative ability. I mean, those are 3 detectives, yes, typically focused on illegal marijuana, but where those investigations lead are often things that our conventional detectives would investigate. Stolen guns, drugs, human trafficking. Those are things that our detectives, as they have time, because we also are very short on detectives, they would investigate. But this essentially gives us the ability to focus dedicated resources on that we just wouldn't have otherwise.
Yeah. Yeah, I was. You took the words out of my mouth because that's where I was going next, is for you to talk a little bit about that you just did, those other crimes that these investigations turn up, and then I assume after that, you guys work with the Lane County District Attorney's Office to, potentially file charges. Um, yeah, I think with this investigation, I believe I didn't see in that press release necessarily those other crimes coming up, but a lot of the other releases I saw, it was the case where we also
Yeah.
recovered, guns and other drugs and things like that.
Yeah. And I do want to be clear, just for the sake of the investigation related to Agricola. We did not find anything illegal in that particular investigation. They were still operating um, at a criminal level as far as the laws concerning marijuana, but I just want to make sure that is clear in this particular case, which really has been the exception to this
Yeah,
point.
that's kind of what I noticed from the releases, is I was like, wow, most of these do turn up something else. So yeah, it's good that those grants exist so that you guys can go out and find those things, but then other crimes as well and deal with those. Um, I also wanted to ask you too, this may be anecdotal, and I'm curious if it ties into the grant, but so I'm based in Washington State. Obviously, this is all anecdotal from me.
Mhm.
I feel like I don't see as many press releases from local police about these big illegal marijuana grows as I do coming out of Oregon. And I also grew up in Southern Oregon. I grew up in Medford for context. And I worked in Medford in my first market. So, like, I just kind of anecdotally, I feel like I see those sort of busts coming out of Oregon a lot. Am I wrong there, or does Oregon maybe just kind of have that particular market for that?
Yeah. Um, yeah, I mean, and I'm not an expert on this by any means, but anecdotally, there was no enforcement regarding this for a very long time in most counties, and that is part of what led to this grant. Is communities were really starting to be, or had been for quite a while, victimized by um, criminal grows. So these are your cartel grows. And when I say cartel, a lot of people think, oh, Mexican cartel. We've had multiple nationalities, cartels from multiple nationalities, um, or excuse me, multiple countries in our county. So we've had marijuana grows that have involved Mexican cartels, but also Chinese, Cambodian, um, and some where it's someone local, maybe even someone that is kind of known to us, but they're doing business with someone else. The product they're making is not staying in Oregon, and typically, you know if marijuana or cannabis products are leaving our state, they're not doing it just to be sold in a dispensary somewhere. That's technically illegal, but it's legal wherever it's going. And typically, it's either going overseas or there's an exchange happening that involves hard drugs or firearms or these stolen things. Um, so just that background of these communities having to deal with what they were bringing in, and marijuana has gone through some ebbs and flows of medical marijuana and then recreational, and well, how does that work um, with medical? And again, that those are things I'm not by any means an expert on, um, but what we've also seen as our county really is a little bit late. You mentioned growing up in Southern Oregon, and it's kind of just a thing down there that um, a lot of that is there's a lot of open country, but it's also um, it's an area where it grows well. Just at a starting point, other than some of the water issues of some areas, certainly. But as far as the seasons and the weather and the soil, and that's part of the reason. But then also, as some of the southern counties started to participate in this program, um, it it started to drift north. I should say the criminal enterprises started to drift north because It's not profitable to grow for a whole season and then lose your product that you were hoping to sell out of state and doing as part of a criminal enterprise. Um, so those impacts that we had seen in Southern Oregon started to affect Lane County. Um, and the vast majority of those grows are in the county. There are again, if you look at the news releases and some of the addresses, there are often indoor grows that are in some of our cities, but the majority of them have some kind of link out into the county, which is why, at least at this point, it's largely the sheriff's office um, that's participating in this grant program. Um, and certainly you've probably seen from the news releases that we try to thank the partners that assist us, and again, that's where you probably see Douglas Interagency Narcotics Team, right? That's Douglas County, multiple agencies, but Douglas County. So they've been doing it a lot longer, and they also have, there's a lot of intersection between our cases as well because of just how that market has kind of unfolded.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And is there anything else that am missing about
Yeah.
this investigation in particular? I know, I'm sure there's a lot, but anything that we need to highlight specifically about this most recent investigation, or how you guys are working together, as you said, to kind of combat this illegal marijuana market as a whole.
Yeah. I would say the most um, probably the most important. Well, I'm going to back up and give you just a little bit about Agricola and then the bigger picture before I forget. So,
Yeah.
the interesting thing with this case is that um, we've had legitimate growers come forward, or at least just thank us, and then we've learned more about the business practices of this company that is essentially anytime you're in a business and there's rules in place and there's someone that doesn't follow those rules, it's very hard to compete. Um, and the legal marijuana market is already, there are a lot of laws and rules, and it's regulated. That's absolutely not lost on us. And then when you have this other company that isn't following any of the rules, isn't doing anything they're supposed to, uh, not only are they likely going to be more profitable, but now they're going to be able to undercut everybody else, and have some of those business practices that are essentially to put everybody else out of business. So that has been an interesting thing with this case that I can share is we've had legitimate businesses, legitimate marijuana um, businesses come forward and offer information, or even just thanking us for taking the time to do this. As it's as I said, it's a little outside of our past, some of our past search warrants. The bigger picture, and again, I want to segue because we haven't seen this necessarily with the Agricola investigation, but most of our other investigations, there has been a component of human trafficking at some level. Some of them are somewhat voluntary. Um, Often those are maybe the Mexican cartel grows where they have people that volunteer to come up here and they are part of the organization. Um, and then some of them maybe come up not really knowing what they actually signed up for. So typically, for all of the grows where there's a cartel connection or some kind of human trafficking connection, um, these people come up here with promises of pay, promises of how long they'll work. Um, and then oftentimes they're being pulled from a lower socioeconomic status. They don't speak the language and they don't know anything about our laws and our country, which makes them very easy to victimize. So um, very often when we serve these search warrants, we'll have people that will refuse to come out because they're just scared. Maybe they didn't think this would ever happen because they know it's legal here, or they've just been told if the police show up, don't do anything, don't say anything, don't don't interact. Um, but then oftentimes as we've made contact with them, which, usually if we know we're going into a group that speaks a particular language, we'll bring an interpreter or have an interpreter service ready. So, when you typically we have to announce, police search warrant, which is great if you speak English, but if you don't speak English, that may mean nothing to you. So we do try really hard going into those to know what we're walking into and be able to communicate with them, which can be challenging. Sometimes we've had, someone who speaks Mandarin, but not that dialect. Some of those issues that we've had to work through. But for those people, typically when we encounter them, we have an idea of who we're looking for and who's a worker, who's being human trafficked. Typically those people, we're not putting them in handcuffs. We're not, we're interviewing them. We're doing our investigation. But we're then often trying to hand them off to a group that will help them, with varying degrees of success. Certainly a lot of them are still going to have that fear of, now the cartel that brought me over here knows that I talk to law enforcement. And, if I go to this group, they're going to know I'm where I went and that I'm with this group. And so they'll sometimes just choose not to have any assistance. Sometimes they do. But we always try to make that happen, because the other side of that human trafficking piece is these workers are often promised pay, maybe at the end of the growing season, or when they're done with their contract, which may be a years long contract. And what we've seen is oftentimes they're told, oh, it was a terrible harvest. We didn't make nearly as much money. We can only pay you, a quarter of what we promised, which isn't off, which may not be enough money for them to get home. Or maybe the deal was that whoever brought them there was going to be getting them home, and they don't even know how. So some of these search warrants, the people we've encountered, I think the longest one we estimated they had not left this grow property for about 3 years as an estimate.
Wow.
Certainly for more than a year. And other than a few exceptions to maybe walk to the grocery store, or to a nearby store to get food. But beyond that, they weren't allowed off the property. And even if they had gotten off the property, they may not, oftentimes they won't have a cell phone. They don't speak the language. They don't actually know where they are, beyond somewhere in America, maybe. So that,
That's
that,
huge.
yeah. And it's very frustrating to work through because, the flip side of it is we, at some level we have removed whatever meager income they were getting for being there
Yeah.
now. Which also isn't lost on us that, yes, maybe we have freed them from this scenario that was completely unwinnable. They were never going to get paid what they were promised, and maybe we're never going to get brought home. But at the same time, now their job's gone. The tent that maybe they've been living in for a year is gone. Yeah, so they're very interesting cases to work through, when they involve that human trafficking component.
And are those, I'm just curious, certain instances of that, is ICE brought in any way to, deal with it on some end if they are here illegally?
No.
Do you guys kind of just
So
let them go about, what happens after you kind
yeah,
of release them from this?
so Oregon law, um, is and has been for several years, very explicit about not working with immigration and customs enforcement. And that includes in jails and on patrol. And then it also includes when we work with federal partners. You probably saw with a lot of these releases, you see oftentimes the DEA or the FBI or Homeland Security are involved. Um, they are involved at the a level that supports our investigation. What a federal organization may choose to do with information that we get um, would ultimately be up to them. But they're also very aware of Oregon law um, and aware of those limitations on us, which we take very seriously. As I said, it's been I know it's been in the news a lot lately, and it's kind of a new thing for a lot of jurisdictions to work through. That's not the case in Oregon. It's been very clear for a long time, and most of our federal partners, especially locally, are very aware of that. Again, I can't speak to what our federal partners may do, um, but they're not being used for that purpose at all in our investigations, and uh, and typically have a more of a supporting role, oftentimes in these investigations. Um, does that answer your question?
Yeah, just trying to confirm or deny, right? If like these folks who are victims, essentially to some extent, once you guys kind of clear that grow operation, and if they perhaps don't accept resources, they're allowed to just, they head out, right, of the sheriff's
Yeah,
office or wherever they're
yeah.
at, and they figure out what to do next, kind of, essentially.
Yep. Oftentimes, we'll contact everybody, and identify most everybody, and even that is always, you know, most of the people we contacted in those situations, they don't have ID. They didn't come here with a passport. But once we have done our investigative piece related to the grow or anything found there, if there's drugs or stolen items found there, once we're done with that piece, then we typically release them. Sometimes that release means they have a license and a vehicle, or a licensed person that can drive them, and they leave in their vehicle. Where they go, that's up to them, and typically we don't need to know. And then there's other cases where the investigation, when we're done, they're free to stay on the property. We're not necessarily always seizing the property and making everybody leave, and nobody can come back. Typically we're doing our investigation, and there's a house on the property, there's trailers on the property, maybe tents on the property. Like, this is where these people live. um, so if they don't want to go somewhere else or want other resources, this is effectively their home. And we respect that. We still have to do our searches and our investigation, but once we've concluded, then certainly they're either free to come back on the property, or oftentimes we've just had them at the property the whole time, and then we leave when we're done with our investigation.
Thank you
and
so
and I would also just uh, uh, the other piece of that that's important to us, um, is a lot of times, we serve these warrants at a patrol level, which means it's patrol deputies, dressed like me, that are showing up. Not always the case, depending on information. If we know there's armed people there, or maybe there's been violent crimes that have happened there, then we may have a little bit higher response. Um, but typically, it's at least dressed patrol deputies, and ideally we would just announce ourselves, and everybody comes out, talks with us. There may be some criminal charges, there may potentially be somebody that goes to jail, but then we're done, we leave. But what we see is, because of this legitimate fear, one, of maybe how they were brought there and the organization that brought them there, and then just the unknown of being in Oregon. We oftentimes have to put a lot more work into attempting to even just establish communication, and then doing the search, getting people to come out safely. That's our main goal. in that service of the warrant is for it to be done as safely as possible for everybody. And it's so much safer if people just come out and cooperate. But we all, again, we understand why that isn't always the case, and those kind of underlying factors. So that's something that we just have to navigate. Is this, you know, is this just someone who's afraid and doesn't want to come out, or is this a bad actor who is maybe going to do some attempt harm to us or other people on the property? And more often than not in these cases, they they really just are going to stay there, and hope we go away, essentially.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you for giving me all that context because obviously that, the human trafficking element of this is a huge undercurrent in these investigations. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
Um, my last question for you here is just because you did mention that, some other businesses kind of came forward for this investigation, particularly with Agricola, and kind of helped you guys learn some information. Is there anything that, your average Joe out there or just other business owners should be kind of looking out for? What should they do if they potentially suspect one of these illegal marijuana grows, is going on?
Yeah. The you know Typically the first avenue is contact OLCC. Um, they're the primary regulatory authority of marijuana. Um, there are a lot of legal grows that, in our county, that you know we never we never talk to, we never see, right, because OLCC does that. Um, and oftentimes our investigations originate from OLCC information. Um, that being said, there are investigations that they have zero contact or interaction with OLCC because they are completely illegal, never tried to be legal. You know, they are genuinely just doing their operation at a criminal level. So those would be cases where, again, starting with OLCC would still be appropriate. Um, but then certainly contacting the Lane County Sheriff's Office. Just our non-emergency dispatch number is typically the best place to start. That's just 541-682-4141. That takes you to a dispatcher. You may have to wait on hold. Our short staffing, unfortunately, extends to our dispatch. So they handle 911 calls as well as non-emergency calls, as well as dispatching for multiple jurisdictions, not just the sheriff's office. So they are very busy. So you may wait on hold. Um, but from there, they can definitely direct you questions or information to the appropriate detective